Okay, this presentation is to review the quiz on external analysis, which was completed by all of you, I hope, this week. I'm actually recording this at my home office, so please pardon the birds chirping or the dogs barking in the background. I do have my office window open, but hopefully that won't be too much of a distraction. So, all right, so this is our second module quiz. The first quiz, you may recall, was on Module 1, which was strategic thinking, but it also covered the one day, the course intro lecture on the first day of class. Now, just to remember how I do my grading. I do it, in a forced curve. I sort of guarantee at least the top 40% will get A's in my class. Next 40% will get A minuses. Bottom 20%, if I think they're putting out an effort and they're doing a respectable job, I'm guaranteeing everybody a B plus. But I do occasionally give a grade of B or even below if it really calls for it. But as long as you're somewhere in the pack and you're devoting effort, and I can see that effort, then everybody gets sort of a B plus or above in this class. So in the first module quiz, this is going to be the max, min, and mean of the Module 1 and Module 2 quizzes. Module 1 quiz, course scores range from 31 to 100%. The mean of 81. Module 2, of course, the max is still 100. The mean is roughly the same, a little lower, but the minimum is much higher, which is good. So we don't have extreme outliers at the bottom now. If I was to sort of give you grade ranges, as I mentioned, I don't actually grade. I don't actually assign a letter grade to each quiz. But if I were to do so, if you were just to sort of get what the top 40% were, the next 40%, for Module 2 quiz, the top 40% were about 82 and above. The next 40% were between 66 and 81, and then below that, 53 to 65 would sort of be in the B plus category there. Now this is before there's a few last minute or late minute additions here from last night actually that are probably not included in this, but obviously out of 47 exams, 1 or 2 shouldn't change the overall distribution too much. As I did before, I can't go over all the 23 questions, right? And in fact, there are 16 out of the 23 questions that at least 70% of the students answered correctly. That compares to 22 out of 26 for the previous module. So it's interesting that the overall scores weren't that different, but it seemed that maybe there was more concentration on, whereas we only had to go over 4 questions following the Module 1 quiz, there's actually 7 questions for which less than 70% answered correctly, or answered 100% correctly. And so we had to go over a few more questions, which is another reason, in addition to sort of the family emergency that I had on, prior to Tuesday's class. Another reason that it's sort of good to have me record this and let you view it if you want, outside of class, because we do have to go over almost twice as many questions as last time. And so the 7 questions that were, you may remember last time, all 4 of the questions that were problematic on the Module 1 quiz were related to game theory. They're a little more spread out here. So in the section on external analysis in general, there were 2 questions that were problematic, 2 out of 5. There were 5 questions in that section. 5 force analysis, there were 3 questions, 3 out of 13. That was the biggest section. And then beyond the 5 forces, there were 2 problematic questions, 2 questions 2 and 4, again, 2 questions out of 5. So let's first talk about the question in the first group, external analysis in general. And the first one there was question 3 in section 1. And it said the following. It said, in an external or industry analysis for the U.S. military branches, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, etc., uniformed military personnel would most appropriately be analyzed as part of which the following industry elements? Right? So what is the relationship of U.S. military personnel or uniformed military personnel to the military branches? Are they suppliers? Are they customers, complementers, competitors, potential new entrants, substitutes, rivals? Or would military personnel not be included in an external or industry analysis of the U.S. military branches? To look at that, let's go back to, you may remember this slide. As you know, what I do typically, in addition to sort of explaining the answer, to these questions. I actually go back and show you, where and when we learned these sorts of things, just to spark your memory. Either quoting from one of the required readings, or showing slides, or a little bit of both. Showing slides that I don't really show new slides, but slides that we have already shown in class. So you may remember this slide, and this is actually a part of a broader slide where I talked about the idea of, looking at the broad identification of external players and who they are. And I remember I talked about this idea of marketing myopia, in which typically there's a tendency for, when you talk about external analysis, for people to focus on, for organizations or firms to focus on their customers and competitors, and not much more than that. And I call that marketing myopia. And then I mentioned that the five forces said, well, not only to look downstream at the customers, but what about upstream at suppliers? In fact, in some industries, it's all about competing for suppliers as opposed to competing for customers. But also competitors are defined too narrowly usually, and you've got to think about potential entrants, and there are potential competitors, and also substitutes, right? Maybe not direct competitors, but people or organizations who provide alternatives or similar services or products, right? And so those were the five forces, right? And so the idea was that those are the five forces, and it sort of expanded identification beyond the market myopia. That said, I pointed out to some people look at this and try to figure out, okay, but what about things like, let's think about what a customer means, right? If you're a hospital, who's your customer? Is it the patient? Well, yeah, but it's not like the same as a customer who goes and gets who buys an apple at the store, or buys a new car. The person who's paying for it is not the same person who is receiving it, right? In medical services, you might be paying none of the bills, particularly if you're under TRICARE, right? But if you have medical insurance or Medicare or Medicaid, the reality is that, and this is that there are product or service users and funding sources. And this is true, as I mentioned, in the private sector for things like anything you have insurance for. Even when you buy a house, you're having a bank who's buying the house with you. But also, particularly in the public sector, when your funding is usually determined by some other organization other than those who are benefiting. In the nonprofit sector, if you are a charity, if you are feeding the homeless, the users are the homeless, but the people who are funding you are not typically the homeless. And so the idea is that you've got to break up customers, we said, into sort of the users and the funders. But then the issue came up, for example, with, well, what are the five forces? What about things like labor unions? How did that factor in? Well, one of the issues is that people tend to think very narrowly about suppliers. They think about suppliers of, inputs, but the reality is in many, if not most industries, in fact, especially in the United States, which is a service industry now, the key suppliers are the suppliers. The key input is labor. And therefore, you've really got to sort of break suppliers into input suppliers and labor suppliers, right? And understand that. And understand that when you talk about suppliers, you are including labor suppliers. In the case of labor unions, they're just a powerful, collective, bargaining unit of labor suppliers. But still, these are all still covered by the five forces. We've just expanded, made it clear that customers could be of different types and that suppliers could be of different types. So when we go to this, I went on that slide to add complements and other things as well. But we don't need to go any farther, because we look at this here. We say, well, what are uniformed military personnel to the military branches? Well, they're the employees. Therefore, what is your relationship? You supply labor to the U.S. military, whether it's the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps. They are your employer, and you supply your labor, and therefore or the uniformed military personnel are suppliers. If you were analyzing sort of the external industry analysis of the U.S. military branches. The next question, still in this section on external analysis in general, that was a bit problematic, was question 5. True or false, the economics of organizations in external environment are exogenous or predetermined realities which the organization should accept as given, in other words, unchangeable constraints within which it must identify and pursue a successful strategic position. This is exactly, you'll see here, there's multiple words here trying to emphasize exogenous, predetermined, given, unchangeable, right? Basically saying that the industry, whatever environment you're in, you're stuck with. You got to accept it as given. You don't you don't influence it. It's exogenous, as opposed to the opposite of exogenous is endogenous, meaning something that you can actually is going to change based on your actions. But if it's exogenous, predetermined, unchangeable, right, then it's something that you've just got to accept. That's the way it is, and you've got to figure out what the best you can do given that, right? And the question is that a true or false statement? Well, we can actually go to a couple sources. First, from the industry analysis reading. Here are some quotes I took out of the industry analysis and reading. The core concept reading, or the core curriculum reading on this. Companies can exploit change and even act to shape the industry and its environment in their favor. Industry analysis helps companies analyze how such changes can affect profitability, develop a strategy to compete over time, and explore opportunities to change the industry structure. It is possible for companies to shape an industry to their advantage. There are different ways to shape industry structure. Fragmented industries can be consolidated. Emerging industries can be shaped by the preemption of valuable assets or the creation of customer switching costs, right? So this emphasis on you can shape the industry, you can change the industry. It's not something that's unchangeable. In fact, the firm's actions can shape it or change it. Here's a slide that just a slide that we were presenting on the fundamentals of external analysis. You'll know that couple of the issues under implications. How can a business manage or minimize the power, leverage, or threat or influence of external players? Right, suggesting that you can certainly lower or buyer power or lower supplier power or manage the power or leverage of external players. Also, can a business shape the industry structure to its advantage? And of course, our big example of that in the class was the Cola Wars, right? And in terms of this is a slide that I gave you on general lessons of the Cola Wars, and talked about this idea of shaping industry structure. Coke and Pepsi created the industry in developed markets. It's a classic example of creating and exercising market power. Industry structure is endogenous as well as exogenous, right? In other words, if you remember back to that case study, what were the big barriers to entry? Well, there were things like economies of scale and advertising. Well, is that exogenous? Not necessarily. They chose to make this a advertising intensive industry. It really wasn't, at the start of it. They made it a lifestyle brand. It's not about does it taste good or is it good for you. It's more about if you're, cool people drink Coke or cool people drink Pepsi or whatever it might be. And therefore they chose to make it, very intense sort of advertising, which raises economy of scale, which raises barriers to entry. Similarly, the proliferation of products, crowds out shelf space, which makes access to distribution and channels very difficult. Long-term perpetual contracts with bottlers also made access to distribution difficult. The point being that these sort of barriers to entry were things that were endogenous, right? Brand awareness. These things were not inherently based on the economics of cola, but they're things that they chose to do. And the same thing with, they dictated the nature of rivalry. They dictated the issues like buyer power, supplier power. So again, they don't take it as exogenous, but it is in fact, industry structure is also endogenous. And so therefore, this question, the economics of organization and external environment are exogenous or predetermined realities which the organization should accept as given or unchangeable constraints within which it must identify and pursue a successful strategic position. The answer, of course, is false. That is false. It is you can shape. It's not always easy, and you're not, if you're a small player, maybe you can. It may take time, but you can certainly shape, and it's important to see opportunities to shape industry structure. All right, so those are the two questions that were difficult in the external analysis and general section. On the 5 forces analysis, there were 13 questions, and 3 of those were, like I said, I guess I'll call them problematic, ones in which less than 70% answered correctly or answered 100% correctly if there were partial credit. So the first question was question 1. If the focal industry, in other words, the industry you're analyzing, right, has a credible threat of backward integration into its supplier market, so that you can basically, if you think about yourself as being the focal industry, if you can be your own supplier, you can backward integrate. You can do what your suppliers do. This threat tends to increase the overall profitability of that focal industry. True or false? Well, let's see what we sort of have is what we've said in our readings and slides, and then we'll talk about the logic. Here is actually just to give you an idea of this important of forward or backward integration. These at the section on supplier power in your reading. Actually, in the section in each section under buyer power, supplier power, rivalry, substitutes, and let's see, it was buyer power, supplier power, substitutes, and rivalry. I don't think they had to chart under the threat of new entry, but under at least those last four forces, in the reading, there's a chart at the end of it that just talks about the different factors affecting that force. Oh, there's also a chart, for example, for complementers. And this isn't all of them. I couldn't write them all on one slide, but I just put up some factors, more significant factors that are affecting the bargaining power of suppliers here. Such as the suppliers are more concentrated than industry rivals, the industry participants are face switching costs, suppliers offer differentiated products, or this credible threat of forward integration. I want to highlight that one because that's what we're talking about. We're talking about backward integration or forward integration. And this says suppliers who can credibly threaten to compete with their customers have more bargaining power than those who cannot. Right? So if your supplier, this says if your supplier can credibly threaten to say, you know what, I don't need you, I'll do it myself. You know, if Intel is supplying microprocessors and says is not getting a good deal on them from, you know, Dell and HP and Acer and Lenovo, and they said, you know what, we'll make our own PCs, which they can do, which they actually have done. That gives them additional bargaining power because they sort of, you know, have the outside option always of doing it themselves. That raises supplier power. Of course, the reverse logic applies as well. You know, if you don't, it's basically saying if your suppliers don't need you that much, then they have higher bargaining power. Well, the reverse is true as well. If you don't need your suppliers that much, so you could backward integrate and you could be Dell and say, you know what, you know, I'm going to make my own, you know, microprocessor. I'm going to make my own inputs, right? Think about, you know, Apple did a lot of this. They did a lot of forward and backward integration and avoided sort of the bargaining power. For example, the significant bargaining power lies with Microsoft in terms of supplying the operating system to the Dells, HPs, Acers, and Lenovo's. Well, Apple supplied their own OS so that they wouldn't have that sort of supplier power issue. And the same, again, extending the logic, if you look at the chart here on bargaining power of buyers, here's some very similar things. And here we see, for example, the credible threat of backward integration. Customers who can credibly threaten to manufacture their own inputs have more bargaining power than those who cannot, right? And this is talking about your buyers. If buyers say, you know, we don't need you, we can do it ourselves, they have bargaining power. But remember, you are the buyers to your suppliers. So this is saying, you know, that if you can credibly threaten to manufacture your own inputs, you're going to have more bargaining power. Right? And so again, if you have a credible threat of backward integration, that's going to raise your bargaining power. I talked about this in terms of, you know, this slide's about, you know, the bargaining power of suppliers. I talked about, do the firms have the knowledge to backward integrate? Do suppliers have the knowledge to forward integrate? Right? Again, the logic here is that, you know, if you don't need them, if you have in general, bargaining power is based on having options. You know, if I have more options than you do, and then that gives me more leverage. And so if one of my options is to simply do what you do, right? If you're not giving me a good deal, you know, I'm saying, you know, maybe I'm Apple Computer and I can't get computer stores to stock my machines. You know what? I'll do my own Apple stores, which they did, right? You know, alternatively, you know, if you can't, you know, get your supplier to, you know, produce, you know, on good terms and, you know, or produce what you want or do it at a good price to you, you say, you know what, forget about it. I'll do it myself. Right? That gives you leverage. And so therefore, if the firms have the knowledge to backward integrate, that reduces the supplier power because it raises the firm's bargaining power. Whereas if suppliers have the knowledge to forward integrate, that raises the supplier power because it raises the bargaining power of those suppliers because they have more options as opposed to having to deal with you. You'll see here also on this slide, we're talking about the value of the five forces being about analysis and listed everything that was sort of a factor in the different forces. You'll see here on the left, the bargaining power of suppliers is influenced by the threat of forward integration relative to the threat of backward integration by firms in the industry. You know, who has the bigger, more outside options? You know, am I able to do what you do? Are you able to do what I do? Who is more likely or more able to do it themselves? Right? DIY. And again, here on this, where I talked about breaking those things into identification, incentives, information, interdependence, implications. Here you see again the firm capability to backward integrate as something that's in the information category about affecting the bargaining power of suppliers. Right? So, going to this question, if the focal industry, the industry you're handling, has a credible threat of backward integration to its supplier market, this threat tends to increase the overall profitability of that focal industry. Well, let's think about it. It's saying if the industry can backward integrate and therefore become its own supplier, right, into its supplier market, what does that do? Well, the first thing is that will lower supplier power. If I am able to say to my suppliers, you know what, if you don't give me what I want at the price I want, I'll do it myself. That raises my bargaining power and therefore lowers supplier power. And if industry faces lower supplier power, that will tend to, of course, increase industry profitability, right? And so therefore this statement, if the focal industry has a credible threat of backward integration, this threat tends to increase the overall profitability of that focal industry. That answer is true because it lowers supplier power. All right, and so then the next question on five force analysis, question 2, the very next question, also true or false, which is related to buyer power and supplier power, and based on the prior discussion, you can see why I asked this question, because it is something that people get tripped up on a lot. Buyer power and supplier power are opposing external forces such that an industry subject to relative high buyer power will consequently be subject to relatively low supplier power, right? Are they opposing external forces, and are they always the opposite? So high buyer power always means low supplier power, and low buyer power always means high supplier power, vice versa. You can't have high buyer power and high supplier power. You can't have low buyer power and low supplier power. They've got to be opposite. That's what this question is saying. Is that true? And although they are sort of mirror images of each other, right? The reality is your buyers negotiate with you and your suppliers negotiate with you. They're not negotiating with each other, right? You are the buyer to your supplier. So if you have, so from their perspective, it's about buyer power, but from your perspective, it's about supplier power, and vice versa. And sort of to give you the real point, remember this diagram here. I talked about all the possibilities: bargaining power and value distribution, how it's related to value distribution. We had the customer willingness to pay, the supplier opportunity cost, and then that difference was the total value created. And the question is, who captures it? And I mentioned that the ideal scenario is you have low buyer power and low supplier power, which leaves a lot for the firm. But you could, the worst scenario is high buyer power, high supplier power, right? But you could have any combination, right? This previous question said, look, this previous question basically said, true or false, that only the two middle options are possible. That you can only have low buyer. If you have low buyer power, you have to have high supplier power, or if you have high buyer power, you have to have low supplier power. No, obviously the scenario on the left is low buyer power and low supplier power. Scenario on the right is high buyer power, high supplier power. So so if you go to that question, right, an industry subject to relatively high buyer power will consequently be subject to relatively low supplier power. The answer is false, right? It could be that way, but it doesn't have. But it's not, that high buyer power means low supplier power, or vice versa, right? Now, again, though, right, if you have low supplier power, then from your supplier's perspective, they face high buyer power. That's true. But the industry is not subject. The industry you're analyzing, the buyers are completely separate, right? From this, saying that I have bargaining power relative to my suppliers says nothing about my buyers, or saying that I have high or low bargaining power relative to my buyers says nothing about my relationship with my suppliers. They're completely unrelated, right? But again, the things that dictate them are the same, because things that you would do to analyze your supplier power are the things that your supplier would do to analyze buyer power, because to them, you're their buyer, and to you, they're your supplier. And so the analysis of bargaining power in those relationships will be labeled buyer power issues for them, but supplier power issues for you. But for the industry itself, which is what this question asks, these are not, forces that are always going to be, if one's high, the other one's low. All right. So then the last question of the five force analysis was about entry and exit barriers. It says, which of the following scenarios is most attractive in terms of long-term industry profitability? So which is the most attractive, right? And again, we have to say something about entry and exit barriers. Now, entry barriers, people usually don't seem to have as much trouble with this, because just simply, for example, we talked about this threat of new entry being something that minimizes profitability, something you don't want. But here are just some quotes from the reading on industry analysis. When the potential for profit in industry is high, companies have a powerful incentive to enter. New entrants increase competition, driving down prices and profits. The impact of potential entrants on profit depends on how easy it is to enter the industry, which in turn depends on barriers to entry. Right? And so what it's saying is this: if there's low entry barriers, then there's a high threat of entry, because it's easier to enter, obviously, with low barriers. Well, if there's a high threat of entry, that is going to produce lower industry profitability, right? And so that's the basic logic. It's the basic logic of the entire analysis of the threat of new entry. So therefore, I don't think it was too hard for people to figure out that that low entry equals low entry barriers equals lower entry profitability. Therefore, what's most attractive? Well, C and D clearly aren't, right? They both talk about low entry barriers, so we can rule those out. Low entry barriers are not attractive in terms of long-term industry profitability. You want to have high entry barriers, so it's going to be either A or B, right? So when it comes down to, we know we want high entry barriers. What about exit barriers? If we can, holding everything else constant, right? Would we rather have the exit barriers be high or low? Well, what do we have to say about that? Well, again, from the industry analysis reading, this is just a snippet from the rivalry section. The following factors contribute to intense industry competition, and there's other factors listed, and there's something before this about price sensitivity or price what drives price competition. But here there's some bullet points in the reading about many competitors of roughly equal size and power, about slow industry growth, or high exit barriers. Right? When it is easy to exit an industry, low prices drive out the least profitable suppliers, and industry prices rise. But when exit is costly, excess supply remains and pricing pressure persists. And this high exit barriers, therefore, contribute to intense industry competition. The logic here is this, right? The purely competitive model that you'd learned in your GB 3010 Econ 101 type class, has free entry and exit, right? And the idea is that when profits go up, firms enter. When profits go down, firms leave, right? Well, if you have high entry barriers, when profits go up, firms don't enter. So they don't compete away the profits. But what happens when profits go down? Well, with low exit barriers, so free exit, firms leave. And so therefore profits don't go down for long, or they go down and firms exit, and they are able to get back to their levels that are profitable or that sustainable, right? But when you have high exit barriers, when profits go down, firms don't leave because they can't leave and they stay in there, and therefore low profitability that would normally be eliminated because firms would exit is not. And so therefore an industry with high exit barrier is subject to lower profitability because on the downswings you don't have firms exit. You have too many firms stay. If you had lower exit barriers, firms would leave, but more stay, excess supply, lower profitability. And also that was the reading, but also in the slides. Remember, I talked about this in rivalry. I talked about, are there high barriers to exit? What is the level of commitment to this industry among rivals? And I gave that exact same logic: is that if firms are going to stay in there, then that's going to have more firms equals more competition equals lower profits overall. Right? And so therefore, if we look at these answers, right, you do not want to have high exit barriers, because what high exit barriers means is that when you have high exit barriers, that again, that is going to prevent any exit, when profits go down. So profits aren't going to be bounced back; they're going to stay down, and therefore you'd like to ideally have high entry barriers and low exit barriers. Now, I have heard, the argument certainly has a point to it, but I want you to understand this. It's been said, well, wait a minute, but if you have high exit barriers, aren't firms less likely to enter in the first place? And the answer is yes, but that's circular logic. You can't have it both ways. In other words, you could say, well, there's high exit barriers, therefore firms won't enter. Well, then you must have that translates to low entry barriers. You can't have high entry barriers. In other words, you have high entry barriers and high exit barriers. The net effect. So if I'm saying I have high entry barriers and high exit barriers, I'm saying despite having high exit barriers, right? I still have, despite having high exit barriers, or despite having low exit barriers, I still have high entry barriers. That's the ideal. In other words, what I'm trying to say is this: is you can't say that high exit barriers are good because they prevent entry. That might be true. So therefore you have high entry barriers. But holding that constant, would you then rather have, if you could hold the entry barriers constant, would you rather have high or low exit barriers? The answer is you'd rather have low exit barriers, right? And so in other words, the point is that any powerful effect, if you have high threat of substitution, high supplier power, high buyer power, high rivalry, all of those things are going to make firms less likely to enter. Right, and so, but you have to analyze the entry barriers separately. I mean, yes, those things have an effect on the likelihood of entry, right? But it's circular logic to say other forces, such as exit barriers, such as rivalries, such as are preventing entry without separately analyzing the entry barriers. And so, again, I want you to understand that said, I believe I gave partial credit to anybody who chose answer A. But in Sakai did not give partial credit. I went back through and did it. But again, what is most attractive is going to be, without a question, B, high entry barriers and low exit barriers. All right, so those are the 3 questions that were in the 5 force analysis section. So the last bit is then on the beyond the 5 forces. So questions 2 and 4 out of those last 5 questions. Question 2 was about complements, and it was actually the following: suppose product C is a complement, right? C for complement to the primary product P, P for product. Which of the following conditions would tend to increase profitability for producers of the product P, right? So not the complement product, but the producers of the core product or the central product P, holding all else equal relative to the state alternative condition, right? And so then I listed, I believe there's 4 conditions here, and say which one of these tends to increase profitability, holding everything else equal. So let me go through each of them, actually, each of the 4 things, and I may present them in a different order than they were on your quiz. In fact, the order may have been randomized. I can't remember. But let me go through each of them. So one of them says the complementary product C is available in only limited quantities and varieties, as opposed to being available in significant quantities and varieties, right? And so the idea is it better for the profitability of producer of product P to have limited quantity and available varieties of their complements, or to have lots of complements of many different varieties? Well, again, the whole idea here is that, I think this one was probably the most obvious, but we talk about this idea of, here's a slide, we talked about the importance of increasing the availability of complementary products or services, right? A complement is something that if a complement for your product is something that increases the more complements are available for your product, the higher quality complements and the variety of complements raises the value of what you provide. So you would, holding all else equal, would you rather have, think about it, would you rather have more, if you're Nintendo or PlayStation or Xbox, would you rather have more games of more varieties written for your platform or fewer? Well, the more games you can play in it, the better games you can play, the more variety of games you play in it, the more attractive it is, right? And so if the complementary product is instead available in only limited quantities and varieties, as opposed to being available in significant quantities and varieties, that will lower profitability for producer product P, because the complements raise the willingness to pay and the value of what you provide. So that is not a correct answer, because that does not increase the profitability for producers of product P. The next situation or condition provided was the following: the customer's cost of switching between providers of complementary product C is higher than the cost of switching between providers of the primary product P, as opposed to vice versa, right? And so this is the idea of, well, is it easier to switch your product or the complements, right? And suppose it's harder for the customers to switch their complements. They're going to stick with their complements. They're going to sooner switch your product than they're going to switch the complements. And so let's look at what we said about this. Here's this table on the factors affecting complements, or some of the entries, not all the entries that were in that table in your reading. But one of them is this idea of relative switching costs. If it is easier for users to switch across competitors than it is across complements, complements have significant power, right? The logic here is this, and then I also here, by the way, talked about how significant are buyer costs to switch complements versus costs to switch among focal products, right? And the logic here is this: is that, think about, for example, would you sooner give up? Is it harder for you to give up all of your software, or to get a new, to switch from a Dell computer to a HP computer or a Lenovo or Acer, right? Your software will run on any of those platforms, and therefore, but would you give up, all of your Windows software, all your software? Would you rather stop using Microsoft Excel and Microsoft Word, or stop using a Dell computer? If you had to switch and if you had to no longer use, Microsoft Office, that for most people would be a bigger impact than saying I could no longer use Dell, I had to use a HP, Acer, or Lenovo, or vice versa. And so the point is, it's easier to switch the focal product, and that raises the profitability of the complement maker, in this case, in this example, Microsoft, and lowers the profitability of the producer of the focal product, which in this case was PCs, the Dells, the HPs, the Acers, and the Lenovo's. And so here, if the customer's cost switching between providers of complementary products is higher than the cost switching between the providers of the primary product, as opposed to vice versa, again, holding all else equal, right? That's going to lower profitability for producers of product P. If you could have the same quantity, variety, everything of complements, but people could switch them easily, right? That would lower the bargaining power of the complementers. The complementers would capture less of the pie, and therefore you would have more. You would be able to have more profits yourself. But instead, if people are stuck with their complements, then that gives the complement provider more power, and that's going to therefore lower the profitability for the producers of the core product of the product P. Well, so that can't not be correct answer. So that is not a correct answer to question 2 here. It does not tend to increase the profitability for producers of the product P. The next one is about producers of complementary product C possess a greater capability and therefore a more viable threat to integrate into production of the primary product P than the capability and threat of product P producers possess to integrate into production of product C, as opposed to vice versa. Okay, what does all that mean? It's saying, can you produce your own complements, or your complements do what you do? So when we're thinking about this idea of, again, think about the bargaining position of Electronic Arts or Activision or some game maker relative to Nintendo, right? Who has the bargaining power, holding all else equal? If Nintendo can make their own games, which they do, and they make the best games or the best-selling games in their platform, that would raise their bargaining power relative to Activision and Electronic Arts. On the other hand, if Activision and Electronic Arts could get into the console business, and produce their own platform, not just games, right, that would raise their bargaining power, right? Well, again, that's a harder thing to do. And so in that scenario, because one has greater bargaining power, greater ability to produce their own complements, that raises their leverage. I talked about this idea about how why does Apple make a word processor, a spreadsheet, and a presentation software? Nobody uses those relative to those who use Microsoft Office, but it gives them some bargaining power because, frankly, in the computer business, they're very dependent upon Microsoft. Microsoft makes a larger percentage of the software that's sold from the Mac OS than for the Windows OS. Even though they own the Windows OS. Is that if you look at how dominant Microsoft is in the Mac software market, it's more than their dominance in the Windows application as opposed to OS software market. So again, though, you'll see in our reading we talked about things. Here's this idea, that same table from the bottom of the reading on complements. A complementer that can easily enter the product maker's industry has more power than one that cannot, and vice versa. That's why it's asymmetric. And originally it said asymmetric integration threats, but he just wrote asymmetric threats in the latest version of the reading here. And we talked about that. Here's a slide I gave you on the availability and power of complements, and talked about, do complementers have the knowledge to integrate into providing the firm's product or service, or does the firm have the knowledge to integrate into providing the complementary product or service? If you have and we talked about this in terms of buyer and supply power. If you have the power or knowledge to do what they do, that raises your bargaining power. If you can ever say, you know what, if you don't give me a good deal, I'll do it myself. Do it yourself always raises your bargaining power, whether you're talking to your buyer, your supplier, or your complementer. Right? So if the producer of the complementary product has a greater ability to integrate into production of the primary product, so producer of the complement can produce the primary product, then it's easier for them to do than for the producer of the primary product to integrate into production of the complementary product. What does that do for profitability? Well, it lowers the profitability for producers of the primary product because they have less bargaining power relative to the complementers. Because the complementers have more bargaining power, they can simply say, you know what, if you don't give us a good deal, we'll do it ourselves. And therefore, that also is not a correct answer to this question too. Finally, what if the producers of the complementary products are highly fragmented as opposed to being highly concentrated, right? So again, notice holding all else equal. So the same number of complements, the same quality of complements, the same threat of integration, everything else is the same. Would you rather have your producers be concentrated or fragmented? Well, again here, from that slide, here's from the reading. If complements are concentrated, a dominant complementer can exert more influence on industry than many smaller complementers that compete with one another. On the slide here, I talked about the idea of, are complementers concentrated or fragmented, right? In the end, the idea is if your complementers are concentrated, if you're, like Microsoft is very dominant in providing software for the Mac OS, application software, or over time in the video game industry, it used to be that they were very fragmented. Now they're much more concentrated. That raises the bargaining power of the complementers and therefore lowers the bargaining power and the ability to capture profits of the core product if they're concentrated. If they're fragmented, though, they don't have a lot of bargaining power, and that raises your profitability. So going back to the question then, if producers of the complementary product are highly fragmented as opposed to being highly concentrated, what does that do? Well, relative to the alternative, I'd rather have them fragmented than concentrated, so that increases profitability for producers of product P. And so that was the correct answer for question 2. And again, remember, I think the order of these might have been random, so I'm not sure whether this would be answer A, B, C, or D, but that was the correct answer for question 2. It was the only one that would tend to increase profitability for producers of product P. And finally, the last question that was problematic at all was this question in section on Beyond the Five Forces, which was question 4, which was basically, this was a question, I mean, there's no denying it. It was testing, did you actually do the reading, right? This is one you could not get out of the slides. You know, as I said, you're responsible for all 100% of the readings as well as 100% of the class concept material. This is one that you could not have gotten out of the class. You had to do the reading and just sort of see if people did the reading, right? So influence efforts related to the creation, modification, and or preservation of external rules or restrictions governing the operations of a business or organization are referred to, at least in your required concept reading, right? I even pointed out to you, where you should look, as are they value net games, public interest games, influence games, diplomacy games, interdependency games, or non-market games, right? Again, like I said, this was a test, not your understanding of concepts, but testing, in some sense, did you do the reading? Okay. Well, here's some quotes from that reading on winning the influence game. One common goal of external influence efforts is to increase or preserve the company's bargaining power relative to other players in the value net. We term these efforts value net games. Value net games concern the creation, modification, and preservation of contractual relationships among players in the value net, business and non-business, that define how value will be created and claimed. Another common goal is to limit the impact of rules imposed by governments in the public interest, for example, concerning taxes and restrictions on conduct. We term these efforts public interest games. Public interest games concern the creation, modification, and preservation of rules governing the conduct of business, for example, tax laws and environmental regulations. So, influence efforts related to the creation, modification, and or preservation of external rules or restrictions governing the operations of a business or organization are referred to as, they're not value net games. Value net games are not about the rules, but about contracts and bargaining power with other players in the value net. Instead, of course, this is exactly the definition of public interest games. Right? And so you just simply had to either have done the reading or be able to, even if you didn't remember exactly what they're called, you could quickly refer to the reading to get this question. The other answer is influence games. Of course, I just threw that in there because there's a lot of talk about influence as you see influence efforts. So I thought, that was something you might be a logical but incorrect answer. Diplomacy games, the case talks about corporate diplomacy, but corporate diplomacy, both influence games and corporate diplomacy games apply to everything. According to their definitions of diplomacy and influence, one type of influence game is a value net game. One type of diplomacy game, they're both influence and diplomacy games, arguably, although they don't use those terms, but they're both examples of influence and diplomacy. Interdependency games, I threw out there simply because, the word interdependence, I like, but really all of these are interdependencies, whether it's public interest games or value net games, all those players are interdependencies. And non-market games, again, is the reading actually points out that they don't like that use of that because the idea is that when you're dealing with some of these players, you may have a non-market player who you actually is part of your value net. So a non-market player you may deal with in a value net game or a public interest game. And so non-market games, the reading specifically says it doesn't like the classification of that categorization. Right? But the point being because it's sometimes hard to label a player as a non-market player or a market player because they play different roles. Anyway, so those were the 7 questions that were somewhat problematic on Module 2 quiz. If hopefully that answered your questions on those. If it didn't, you feel free to email me and we can talk further. But again, if you are unsure about your answer to questions other than these 7, right, then that means it's a question that 70% or more answered correctly. Therefore, your first thing I'd ask you to do is ask your colleagues, right? Because the odds are whoever's sitting to your left got it right. If you got it wrong, then whoever's sitting to your left got it right, and whoever got it right to your right got it right, because more than 70% got that question right. And so ask them. If that's not satisfactory, if there's still an issue with that, then of course feel free to email me. I can email you back. I can talk about it. If it's a problem that I think a lot of people will have, I can even talk about it in class. But hopefully this lecture has saved us some time so that we can actually not had to go over all of this in class. And hopefully this has answered your questions, the most pressing questions to the largest number of people by addressing those 7 issues. All right. Thank you very much.